Nighttime on still waters. This is NB 506812, narrowcasting into the night from somewhere on Britain's waterways. 26th of March, Wednesday. The ash are heavy with bud. Blistered garnet, raspberry-shaped jewels that glow warmly in the low sunshine that picks out the slow contours of the fields in barley light. The perfect warm early spring evening is sliding into night. The dampness in the air adds just a shiver of chill to the almost still air. Clouds too are slowly beginning to gather, although at the moment the sky, blind of the moon, glitters with a swirl of constellations. This is the narrowboat Erica, narrowcasting into the darkness of a late March night to you, wherever you are. You've made it. Thank you for coming. It's almost too warm for a stove, but it softly glows in the corner, warm against the growing chill of the night. And the kettle is singing and the biscuit barrel is full, so come inside and welcome aboard. March has been continuing to live up to Miles Hadfield's hasty panorama of seasons. Days swing in quick succession from honeyed early summer warmth to chill winds and drizzle, to sharp frosts, to damp, mizzling mists. And this propensity seems even being evident in one day. I go to work, bundled in coat and gloves, scraping ice from the windows of the car, and come home in shirt sleeves. Such are the glories of March. According to the calendar of Japanese micro-seasons, those poetically tiny incremental steps through the year, 5 days at a time, we are entering into first cherry blossoms. And locally, plum, the precursor of blossom displays, is nearly over, although mornings and evenings still remain heady with the perfume of a nearby damson tree. The next season that spans the end of March and the beginning of April is distant thunder. Again, it's surprisingly apt. Last weekend we had a terrific nighttime thunderstorm, with incredible flares of lightning and pounding rain that was so heavy the runnels along the cabin roof overflowed. Maggie, who is normally not too worried by thunderstorms, was distinctly nervous. So we all crawled onto the bed together, with her head tucked between us, and listened to the rain drum and rattle down the boat. It was wonderful. And I was put in mind of the Japanese micro-seasons by Lee Thomas, who in turn was inspired by an episode of the podcast from, I think it was last year, Living Inside the Seasons, where I refer to these wonderful Japanese calendars. Lee, as you might know, lives in a wooden cabin high in the Rocky Mountains. And when I say high, I mean high. And although she'd mentioned in the past about life in her cabin 8,000 feet up mountain, it hadn't fully dawned on me how high that is. It's almost twice as high as the highest mountain in the UK. And as Lee says, there's also plenty of people on the Colorado Rocky Mountains who live at 9,000, 10,000 and even 11,000 feet. And she also notes that at 8,000 feet, meteorologists refer to them as the foothills. Well, Lee sent me her calendar of seasons, which, as she says, also is a wry nod towards Drew Marland and her wonderful canal ice thickness chart. and it's really beautiful. So thank you, Lee. An 8,000-foot calendar of the seasons. March, April. Spring starts to blow hard against the mountain's back door, demanding unsuccessfully to be let in. Snow blankets the thirsty ground, or fails to do so, ushering in wildfire season. May. Spring enters shyly. It is welcomed by pasque flowers poking up through the snow, tentative aspen bulbs, and brave shoots of green grass. Birds noisily rejoice. June, July. Glorious summer arrives at last. Much firewood gathering and cutting, camping and revelling in the sunshine. August. Allergy season ushers in the month. Much sneezing. At month's end, a single gold aspen leaf foretells the coming of autumn. September. A luminous guiding of aspens quaking in the perfectly warm breeze. Full woodshed and the primal satisfaction of a successful harvest. Sneezing continues. October. Leaves decorate the ground in a carpet of gold. Winter howls just over the horizon, heralded by the bugling of elk. November, December. Holidays with friends remind us that winter is also beautiful. The joy of snuggling in a firelit nest as the sparkling snowflakes fall outside. January, February. Bitter cold. Winter's charms fade fast. Fantasies of spending 2 months in Hawaii. Oh, thank you, Lee. That's really wonderful. This week I posted on social media about a write-up for this podcast that appeared in Towpath Talk, which is a newspaper that's distributed around the Canal and Waterways Network. And for those who can't get a copy, you can read it online, and I've provided a link in the program notes below. And it's also included in the Behind the Mic page on the Nighttime on Still Waters website. And you can also see David John's video of the podcast and the Erica on his Cruising the Cut vlog. And I'm mentioning that here because I want to thank you so much for commenting on my post about this. Normally I just say, oh, it's far too many people to mention, but I realised that there are some very familiar names that often appear, but I never really get to mention them or thank you. So hello and thank you to Captain Arlo, Sabine Rain, Chris Daly, Wes and Amy from Boat Time, Jason Polite, and also Karen, of course, Olivia Marty, Deb Moon Mountford, Steve Tyrrell, and Rita Johamsen, and greetings to everyone else in Spain, and Tracy Thomas, and Jane Berry. Thank you, Jane. I am really glad that you find this podcast soothing. And Edward Gisalberti. I don't quite know how to pronounce your surname, and I hope I'm doing it correctly or getting it roughly right. And Edward, thank you so much for listening and following. I'm so aware that for some reason I never really get to mention you, so I do appreciate it and thank you. And another name that quite often appears on social media in relation to this podcast is Boyd Godfrey. Boyd, thank you. I really do appreciate for all your follows and your clicks and likes, etc. And also hello to Louise Lambert from the Narrowboat Changing Pace. And also to Jan Olaf Verlo. Greetings again to all you in Norway. And also to Wendy Sengfale. And I hope you and Jeff are well, Wendy. And of course to MJ and to LJ and Bodie. And also to Vanessa from the Mindful Narrowboat vlog. And if you haven't seen her vlog, Our Narrowboat Definitely Isn't Ready for This Challenging Tidal River Journey, number 231, please watch it. It's the most wonderful and understated lesson in confronting ugliness, destruction and negativity with such positivity, creativity and heart. It really is an affirming and a beautiful vlog. So, and again, I'm going to put the link to it in the program notes below. And also hello and thank you to the Narrowboat Poles. And thank you for your really kind words about the podcast, Matt. I'm sure you're going to really love Tom Rolt's Narrowboat. And it's really funny that you mentioned that early episode about liminal spaces as being the one that got you hooked. Strangely for me, when I look back, I think that was the episode where I felt, yeah, there is a furrow worth ploughing here, and that things were beginning to come together in my head, that I can do something with this podcast beyond merely just recounting a day-to-day activities as a sort of like an audio journal. So thank you. And hello and thank you to old friend Captain Bugwash, and to Tania Yorgey, and to Catherine Frierson, and another old friend of the podcast, Kaz. Hi there, Kaz. I hope all is going well with you. And it's also lovely to hear from Mia Holter. I'm so pleased that you love the podcast, Mia. And hello to all in Cape Cod. And also across the Atlantic, hello and thank you to M.A. Page. It's a great pleasure, M.A. And hello to everyone on Vancouver Island. And also thank you to Chris Hinds, Anna McKellar, and to Mind Shambles. And Mind Shambles, I hope those shoots are still appearing and growing stronger by the day. And also there was a lovely comment following the last episode from NASA7722. And I loved your connection that you made with 84 Charing Cross Road. It's not something that had occurred to me, but I think, yeah, I can see how that works. And Mike Bullock got in contact, and Mike is seriously into really good audio field recording. And he got in contact to confirm that most interesting sounds wait until you don't have your recorder handy. So I'm really glad and reassured that it's not just me. And it was really lovely to also hear from Lucy and Rob Bolt on the Narrowboat Jasmine. And Lucy and Rob moved aboard in, and to use their words, as a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to COVID. And I'm really glad that it's all working out. And as you say, it's not for everyone, but if it is for you, this is a really, really beautiful and lovely way to live. And it was also lovely to hear from another old friend of the podcast, and that's Margaret. And Margaret mentioned, had I heard about Radio Lento? And yes, I had. It's a favourite podcast of mine, and I'm sure many listeners would really appreciate it. It's essentially just a soundscape that you can just put on if you want to just go to sleep, or you want your head to go somewhere else. And I'll put the link in the program notes again below. I'm aware that there's a lot of links, and sometimes some of the podcast directories don't really allow it. So if it's not in the program notes, it will certainly be on the NOSW Pod webpage. So thank you for that, Margaret. I also received a lovely email from Glenda Kleinig. Glenda, thank you so much. Glenda lives in Adelaide, or 250 kilometers north of Adelaide, and is currently experiencing drought and extremely hot weather. And you're right, Glenda, it's beyond my imagination probably what you are experiencing up there. All I know is that here I find the heat, and particularly drought, perhaps one of the most frightening environmental landscapes. So I totally understand how you are just longing for a wet autumn and a cold, wet winter. And I hope it comes. And I love the fact that the bird noises from your environment mingle with this podcast. And may they continue to do that. And so I hope everything is nice and comfortable and set up for you now. And yeah, stay with us. Let's walk this journey together. And finally, a big thank you to all of our Lockwheelers for supporting this podcast. They are Gabriela Maria Rodriguez-Veinotte, Kevin B., Fleur and David Mcloughlin, Lois Raphael, Tania Yorgey, Andrea Hansen, Chris Hinds, David Dirom, Chris and Alan on the narrowboat Land of Green Ginger, Captain Arlo, Rebecca Russell, Allison on the narrowboat Mukka, Derek and Pauline on Silver Fox, Anna V, Orange Cookie, Mary Keane, Tony Rutherford, Arabella Holzapfel, Rory with MJ and Kayla, Narrowboat Precious Jet, Linda Reynolds Birkins, Richard Noble, Carol Ferguson, Tracy Thomas, Mark and Tricia Stowe, and Madeline Smith. Thank you. "68 years ago, pretty much to the day, Mum and Dad embarked on a totally new phase in their lives together. It was bold, in some ways surprising, and it involved a whole life change for them, and certainly had a fair amount of risk attached to it. However, in Mum's own words, it was a totally worthwhile risk that was never regretted. Mum had obviously written about this part of their lives in her book, which I've read certain sections as part of our Cathy Chronicles. But when clearing out the house, we found a whole box of books which contained revised versions, and each one forming a standalone narrative of a specific part of Mum's life or our family together, and I think also containing a little more detail. And I'm going to be reading from this book, and I think that you're going to find Mum's account of this part of their life interesting, if only as a snapshot of social history of a world nearly 70 years ago. And by the way, I'm going to continue to pronounce Nestle as Nestles rather than Nestle, as that was how Mum always pronounced it, and as far as I can tell, that was the way it was pronounced in Britain at the time anyway. Canada, There and Back and Why. A totally worthwhile risk that was never regretted, taken by Mick and Erica, as seen through the eyes of Erica. 1. Mick and I were married on the 3rd of September 1955 at St Mary's Church, Rickmansworth, Hertfordshire. After our honeymoon on the Norfolk Broads, we returned to Northwood Hills, Middlesex, where we set up our first home, a ground floor flat in a block of 4 in a small cul-de-sac off the High Street. The flat, which was rented, was actually in the name of Mick's aunt, Helen, who had lived there for many years with her mother, Moz, Mick's grandmother. But neither Helen nor Moz were in very good health, Helen suffering from asthma, and Moz, who suffered with the problems of old age, was also blind. And as time passed, so the load on Helen's shoulders became heavier, and so it was suggested that they might benefit by sharing a home with Chick and the old boy, Mick's parents, who now lived in Herne Bay, Kent. Chick was Helen's sister, and of course Moz's daughter. Knowing that this situation could be beset with many problems, Helen did not want to give up the flat completely at that point, and as we had nowhere to go, it seemed the ideal solution for us to take it over, if only as a temporary measure. We were both out at work. Mick was at Fairy Aviation, and I at Nestles. And as both these factories were in Hayes, Middlesex, this meant that, although our starting times were slightly different, we could both go to work together, either in Joe, my rather battered 1938 Hillman Minx, or on Mick's Royal Enfield motorcycle. When we were home, we spent our time happily working on the flat, redecorating it, buying new curtains, etc., etc., and altogether updating our home to give it the bright and colourful mid-1950s look. And at the same time, I enjoyed my housewifely duties, especially, to my amazement and Mick's relief, in the cookery line. Our first Christmas saw an addition to the family, Kismaspuss, a little grey moggy that we bought as my Christmas present from the Watford pet shop. We were now complete. Gradually our friends started to reappear on a regular basis, especially Pete and Tony, Mick's friends from his youth, and they soon got back into their old habit of joining Mick in his shed at the bottom of the garden, where they happily tinkered with bits of motor car or whatever needed tinkering with, while I supplied them with endless cups of tea. Mick had been living in the flat with Helen and Moz prior to our marriage, since his parents had moved from Wembley to Herne Bay a few years before when, as he hadn't wanted to go down with them, he had moved to Northwood Hills, making his home with Helen and Moz. And Pete and Tony, who both lived in Wembley, had continued to be regular visitors to the flat ever since. We had also started entertaining in a small way, returning the hospitality of our many friends, but now with the added pleasure of being able to wave them goodbye from our own doorstep, and not having to turn out ourselves at the end of a very pleasant evening. After some 6 months, it became apparent that the bitter winds of a North Kent winter were proving too much for Helen's asthma, and so, sadly, they had to give up the idea of living in Herne Bay, and they both returned to the flat, where, fortunately, they were quite happy for us to continue living with them, even if it was a bit cramped. Vicky, Helen's tortoiseshell cat, who had been away in Herne Bay with Helen and Moz, also returned to the fold, and, fortunately, the two cats got on very well. As the months passed and we both earned good money, our savings began to mount, to the point that we could begin to think about buying a small house. We weren't very keen on buying a semi in a row of similar houses in some urban area, which was as much as we could afford locally. And anyway, Mick had always cherished the idea of working for himself, ideally owning a small country garage, with attached workshops, etc. So we bought the Daltons Weekly and browsed through the property for sale pages. And when anything that looked vaguely hopeful was advertised, we set off in Joe, travelling miles, to as far away as the West Country, and eventually finding a cottage with outbuildings and land in the heart of Norfolk, near Thetford. It had everything that we wanted. And so, on arriving home, we excitedly went to the local building society to see about raising a mortgage. But as the property was of wattle and daub construction, it was turned down out of hand. Mortgages were quite hard to get in those days, and nobody would even consider it. I wonder how much it would be worth today. It was about this time, during one lunchtime in the works canteen, that Mick met up with an old de Havilland's apprentice friend of his, Don Kirby, and now also working for Fairy Aviation. Over the years since their apprenticeship days, they had drifted apart, each going their separate ways. But now that the friendship was renewed, and they found that they had a lot in common. But Don was consumed with the idea that there was only one way to get on, and that was to emigrate. And as far as he was concerned, there was no better place than Australia. About this time there was a great many people with the same idea. And to a certain extent, this was being encouraged by the government of the day, insomuch as they were offering grants to help people with the fares to the country of their choice, the proviso being that once there they had to stay at least 2 years. This all planted a seed in our minds. We didn't want to go as far away as Australia, but what about Canada? It had been our habit since we had got married to go out for a drink on a Friday evening to our favourite pub, and there we would discuss any problems or ideas that had arisen during the week. We now discussed Canada. We were still moderately young, with no family commitments, and we had enough money to pay our way there, and, if necessary, back again, and a certain amount for us to live on until we had jobs. We were determined to be free agents. If we went for a couple of years or so, we had already decided that we didn't want to emigrate permanently. We should be able to bring back a nice little nest egg and be able to start that little business dream. At that time, the wages in Canada were twice what we earned in Britain. But of course, in Canada, the cost of living was twice as high. But with careful saving, etc., etc., what we brought back would be worth double. And we were also coming across so many older folk who were regretting not taking the chances when they were young and commitment-free. And this gave us pause for thought. It was either that drear little semi and a big mortgage around our necks, or try our luck. We decided to take the risk. 2. Although we all got on extremely well, it was nevertheless very cramped, and we decided that we should let Helen and Moz have their flat back to themselves again. So we started to look elsewhere. But now that we had decided to emigrate, we only needed to find temporary accommodation, and this we did by buying a 22-foot caravan on a small caravan site at Chandler's Cross in which we had lived, moving in there in the autumn of 1956, and staying there the remainder of our time in Britain prior to emigrating. The story of that interlude appears in another book, but for this narrative, all that need be said is that our time on that site was very happy and busy as we gradually prepared to take the great leap into the unknown. We had definitely decided that Canada was where we wanted to go, and Toronto to be our destination, as Mick knew that this was the engineering centre, and that there were several aircraft manufacturers there, including de Havilland's, and Mick, being an ex-de Havilland's apprentice, felt that that would be very much in his favour, and Avro's being another. We had decided to wait until the following spring before going, in order that we could have the better weather in which to start our new life, this now being autumn. We went up to Canada House in London to put things in motion, and were interviewed by innumerable officials, and underwent the medical, which fortunately we both passed. Whilst there, Mick was told very emphatically that as his trade as an aircraft engineer was one of the most sought after, there was certainly no need to get the job first before going out there, and there certainly would be no difficulty in him finding employment. So, once all the necessary documents had been signed and we had sorted out a sailing date, we would be travelling by sea, as air travel at that time was extremely expensive. And as we were paying our own way, that was a major consideration. We settled back into our normal routine. Although, now going to work from a slightly different direction, I had by now left Nestles and was working at the London and Lancashire Insurance Company in Northwood Hills. So Mick dropped me off there on his way to work in Hayes in the morning, picking me up on his return home. In the interim, between our going to Canada House and our eventual departure, the government of the day began giving every possible encouragement to young people to emigrate, especially to Canada or Australia, to the extent of offering assisted passages, with, of course, certain conditions, i.e. one couldn't return to Britain under 2 years. The grant, I believe, was £10. Every day, the papers were full of advertisements pointing out the terrific opportunities to be had in these young and prosperous countries, where there was plenty of room and work for all. And soon the idea of emigrating was on everyone's mind. We were still, as a nation, only gradually getting over the post-war restrictions and deprivations, and the Suez crisis hadn't helped people's morals. So all too soon it seemed we were sorting out what we were going to take with us and packing the 2 large wooden crates that we had had made by the large timber firm Walker Brothers in Rickmansworth, and what to leave behind in store, my folks' garage. Kismus was going to stay with Helen and Moz until we had settled, and then Pete was going to send her out to us. We sent off our crates in advance, sold the caravan and the motorcycle, and Pete bought Joe my car, and then it was saying sad goodbyes to all our families and friends. For although we were adamant that we would return after a couple of years or so, we were going a very long way away, and at that time, 1957, it was still only the privileged few who could afford foreign holidays, and the world was a very large place. A week or so before we left, the local newspaper got wind of our impending departure, and one of the reporters came round to interview us and took a photograph of us sitting on the Royal Enfield. The article and the picture appeared a couple of days later in the local paper. And we were to spend our last night in Britain with Auntie Kay, my aunt, who lived in Cosham, Portsmouth. And she was going to see us off at Southampton, where we were to board the 11,000-ton motor ship 7 Seas of the Europa-Canada line, the main crew being German, whilst the officers were American. 3. The day of departure dawned, 27th of March, 1957. And after a leisurely morning we gathered our luggage together, and with Auntie Kay made our way to Southampton, where the MS 7 Seas would be waiting to receive us. And although, of course, we were sad to be leaving our families and friends, nevertheless there was a certain amount of excited anticipation as we joined our fellow passengers up the gangplank into what we discovered was a very crowded ship. The only fly in the ointment, as far as I was concerned, was the sight of the small brass band, the musicians dressed in very smart uniform, playing rousing music on the deck, too reminiscent of the Titanic for my liking. After waving goodbye to Auntie Kay, we made our way down to our cabin, where we were greeted by a large bunch of flowers and a great pile of bon voyage cards from all those dear folks we had so recently left. The cabin itself, much to our joy, was an outside one, so at least we had daylight during the daytime, through the small porthole. There was a set of 2 tiered bunks, a barrel chair, and a wash basin. I forget what else, but it was quite comfortable, if not luxurious. After sorting ourselves out, decided to have a look around the rest of the ship. The original departure point was Bremen in Germany, calling in at Le Havre, and then finally Southampton. So the majority of the passengers were continental, and all with the same idea of making a new life in Canada. We joined in the milling, excited crowd as we looked for the dining saloon, the lounges, including, of course, the bars and the shops. We located the toilets and bathrooms and generally acquainted ourselves in what was to be our home for the next 5 days. After our first meal on board, the shipping line being the German origin and crewed by Germans, including presumably the catering staff, the food tended to lean towards the continental style, which Mick and I thoroughly enjoyed, but I think some of the British passengers found it rather rich. We sat at long tables with white tablecloths set out very nicely, and were waited on by stewards who, of course, were German. Mick had the feeling that one or two of them were distinctly hostile towards us, being British. But by now we had set sail, but still being in the English Channel, the boat's movements was very gentle, and no one appeared to be affected by it. And after they had dined, many of the passengers were able to thoroughly enjoy the partying mood that was very much in evidence in the bars later on in the evening. Although I think there were quite a few the next morning who rather regretted being quite so carefree, as far as the drinking was concerned, by the empty chairs at breakfast. We ourselves had turned in early after a quick drink, as we were so very tired. By the following morning, we had left the moderately safe haven of the English Channel, and were now well out to sea on the Atlantic Ocean. No one had to tell us that. The motion of the boat was evidence enough, and I was feeling distinctly off. Mick was completely unaffected by the rolling movement of the ship, and continued to enjoy his food, but by the next morning I felt too ill to get out of my bunk. But before I succumbed to the seasickness, I had enjoyed looking around at the shops that sold so many interesting and novel items. Among them was a toy hedgehog, dressed as a working roadman, Meckie. Everything about Meckie was correct in every detail, including having a pipe tucked into his rope belt and mud on his boots. I fell in love with him, and this was one of the very few luxuries we allowed ourselves, as we knew that we had to look after our pennies. But we bought him. We found out later that Meckie was a traditional toy character in Germany, as Mickey Mouse was in America. And our cabin steward, a man of rather more mature years than the average steward, and had appeared rather brusque when we first met him, but we found once that he got to know him to be a very kindly soul, and in spite of the language difficulty, we got on very well indeed, and he was thrilled with our purchase. And throughout the voyage, when we got back to our cabin, we would find that he had put Meckie in different places about the cabin, one day finding Meckie looking out of the porthole. But by the third day, I was past caring, and was lying in bed on my bunk, feeling absolutely terrible. When our steward came in to tidy up the cabin, he took one look at me, and in broken English said that I could spend that day in bed. But I was to get up the next, and in the meantime, he would get me some food and something to drink. Sure enough, it wasn't long before he returned with a plate of salami sandwiches and a mug of black tea. I looked at them with horror. Even the thought of salami made me feel worse. And so I lay all that day, the rolling motion of the ship tossing me from side to side. Then suddenly, in the middle of the night, I felt terribly hungry and thirsty, and that repast I had spurned earlier suddenly seemed most attractive, and before I knew it, I had eaten and drunk the lot. And when morning came, I felt that I dare not be found in my bunk again, and gingerly climbed out of bed, and found to my amazement that I didn't feel as bad as I thought I would, and once on the move I gradually grew accustomed to the movement of the ship, so long as I didn't put my head down, making reading completely out. But I was even able to enjoy the meals again. It was very evident by the depletion in the numbers of passengers walking about that seasickness had hit a lot of people, and I shall always be grateful to our steward for not letting me give in to it, or else I might have been one of the many who took to their beds soon after the start of the trip and remained there until we docked, when they gradually emerged looking very ill indeed. What a way to start a new life. We soon got into the routine of life aboard, which mainly consisted of eating. If it wasn't a main meal, it was snacks that were being brought around. And quite early on, we met up with a British couple who sat near us in the dining saloon, Pat and Ron Cooper. They came from the West Country, where Ron had been an agricultural engineer and Pat a secretary, and they were hoping to get similar work in Canada. And they, like us, had opted for Toronto, with the feeling that that was where the greatest opportunities were. But unlike us, they had friends already over there who had made that great step several years before, successfully, and they were going to stay with them initially. In the next episode, we will hear about how they finally docked and Mum and Dad took their first steps on Canadian soil, but not before they encounter one of those notorious mid-Atlantic storms. This is the narrowboat Erica, signing off for the night and wishing you a very restful and peaceful night. Good night. Temperature outside 5.6 degrees. Inside 20 degrees. Humidity 82%. Dew point 3 degrees. Wind direction south. Wind strength 5 miles per hour. Barometric pressure 1023.7 rising. Cloud cover 10%. Cloud ceiling none. Precipitation nil. Moon phase 9% waning crescent. Day length 12 hours 35 minutes. Sunset 18:31. Sky casting 5:33.